It's time to talk betting lines here for Week 12 of college football here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. And the very best way that we know how to do that is to bring in Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info, who has joined us each and every week for the past couple of college football seasons and the NFL playoffs to break down the odds. Steve, we always appreciate the time. We've got a pretty sparse schedule because the SEC does its annual bye week leading into the big rivalry weeks. The rivalry week in which only a couple teams in the SEC playing each other. The rest of them basically have scrimmages. So we'll start elsewhere with Ohio State taking on Maryland in College Park. Of course, the Buckeyes got off the deck to a certain extent with maybe a half impressive win against Michigan State on the defensive side of the ball, preparing for Michigan, as I've seen this line anywhere from 14 to 17.
Yeah, it's interesting because my power ratings actually favor Ohio State by 17. Currently, the consensus line's around 15 right now. So it's the second week in a row in which the line has not been inflated. Last week, that 3.5 was pretty much spot on, I thought, as far as what the line should be against Michigan State. We talked about that on the show, and I mentioned it was the first time in a while in which the line was not overinflated on Ohio State. And it's also the first time since mid-September that they covered the point spread. They had lost 5 in a row against the number, despite winning 4 of those 5 games straight up. So it looks like we're starting to get a fair number here. The big takeaway for me last week, as you mentioned, Mark, was that the defense played much better than expected. This is an Ohio State defense that had been average, slightly below average, actually, statistically all season, and held Michigan State to just 6 points. Now, obviously, Michigan State, not a very explosive offense. Maryland's a better offensive team. They actually are averaging 6 yards per play. And they're actually not a bad defensive team. They're allowing just 5 yards per play, which is actually much better than Ohio State. Ohio State allows 5.7. So we're getting a 2-touchdown home dog here with a better defense, yet the line looks a little short to me.
You know, Steve, it's interesting because with the surprising emergence of Northwestern and Pitt, not in the national rankings, but within their own divisions, Northwestern already winning a division championship with 2 weeks left to play. Pitt basically in the same position in the Coastal Division. It's sprung open a ton of games with decent teams, but they're really not playing for any championship aspirations all of a sudden. The likes of Iowa, Wisconsin, all sorts of teams across the country. And I see a ton of games like that. So Northwestern Minnesota intrigues me in that Northwestern plays what we would consider to be 2 bad teams after they've made it through the tough teams in the Western Division. They've got Minnesota and Illinois, but they just wrapped up the division championship, but they can't play for a college football playoff. They're in this middle ground. How do they approach it against a Minnesota team that we would have said was awful a few weeks ago, coming off a drubbing of Purdue as a double-digit underdog?
Yeah, I think on the surface, this is probably not a very good scheduling spot for Northwestern. The problem is the line is too short. My power ratings actually favor Northwestern by 4 points in this game, yet they're only about a 1-point favorite on the road. So despite the bad scheduling situation, and maybe that's why the line is shorter, maybe the odds makers have correctly priced it in, but it does not look like a great spot for Northwestern. You're going from being an 11-point dog and winning outright, wrapping up the division, as you said, against Iowa, and having just 2 games now against Minnesota and Illinois, and this being a road game with their home finale next week, definitely does not look like a good scheduling spot for Northwestern, even though the line is too short.
We have a similar situation with East versus West game in the Big Ten, where Michigan State has been out of the race for quite some time. Of course, Nebraska from pretty much week 2 of the Big Ten schedule, but they're playing much better in recent weeks. Michigan State seems to be playing for pride despite the 20-point loss to Ohio State. I don't think that was a lack of effort. So Michigan State at Nebraska, where you think there's a great disparity, but maybe not necessarily according to your numbers.
Yeah, the thing about Nebraska, as we've talked about each and every week here in this show, is you want to start to see something from them. We knew they would start slow with the new coaching staff, but there is some talent still on that team. And I do think they could be a play-on team here over the next few weeks. The big question for me is which Michigan State team shows up. Is it the team that only scored 6 points last week in a bad loss against Ohio State? That game was pretty competitive down the stretch. It was really the fourth quarter where they fell behind and Ohio State pulled away and won it. But you do worry about a little bit of a hangover, and I do think maybe we're starting to get some value with Nebraska. I mentioned last week I don't want anything to do with Nebraska as a big favorite, but in more competitively priced games, I think maybe they could start to become a play-on team here in the final month of the season.
I had thought that the Utah-USC game would decide the Pac-12 South Division, but those teams have faltered in other games, and it's just a logjam with the Utes, Arizona State under Herm Edwards, and USC all with 3 losses And that's pretty much how it shapes up right now. Arizona also with just 3 losses. Actually, USC stands at 4-4. So Utah goes to Colorado, and the Utes seem to be the best team in the division, but not by a whole lot.
Yeah, what's interesting about this game is a lot of times you have an altitude edge with teams like Colorado at home, and it's a factor I use especially in college basketball. But of course, that would not apply when Utah is playing Colorado. So I think that'd be less of an issue here. Colorado is a team that I was looking to fade over the last couple months. I actually used them this past week for the first time in a while. It did not work out. Not sure what to make of this Buffalo squad right now. Overall in the season, Colorado is now just 5-5 after starting the season 5-0. They've lost 5 straight games. They've gone 1-4 against the number. A bad showing last week in that 31-7 loss against Washington State. Meanwhile, Utah has won 5 of the last 6, both straight up and against the spread. So these are really 2 teams right now heading in opposite directions. I think that's somewhat been priced into the point spread, obviously, but maybe not enough.
Steve, I check out the schedule here and I see a ton of games that would have been big 2 weeks ago or are typically good. They look like a good matchup in regards to name brand, and they're just pretty meaningless at this point. So I'm going to go the opposite direction with a game that's been meaningless for one team, and really both because of the non-conference status of Notre Dame in forever. But Syracuse, Notre Dame, this has suddenly become a near top 10 matchup with these teams hooking up at Yankee Stadium. A huge game.
Yeah, my power ratings favor Notre Dame by about 14.5. This is a neutral field, obviously. Syracuse, an in-state team, but Notre Dame will probably have the bigger crowd support, being in the New York City area. Syracuse has been sneaky good this season. Tough to know what to make of them exactly. This is a team that continues to play better than expected. Keep in mind, they almost beat Clemson on the road this year. And I know there was a quarterback situation for Clemson in that game, but Clemson's looked really good since and has blown out most opponents. Meanwhile, Syracuse coming off an impressive win against Louisville last week, led to Petrino being fired afterwards. They put up 54 points. In fact, they have scored 37 points or more in 6 of their last 7 games. This is an explosive offense. It's averaging 44.5 points on the season. Yet they're only averaging 5.9 yards per play against a schedule that allows 6 yards per play. And the reason I mention that is they have not played good defensive teams, just like Louisville last week. They have not faced a tough schedule of defenses. Notre Dame allows 4.5 yards per play. So Notre Dame's defense is 1.5 yards per play better than the schedule Syracuse has faced this year. And I think for that reason, Notre Dame probably is a little undervalued here, as I mentioned. My power rating is favored by more than 2 touchdowns. The line's only around 10. 65.5, a big total. But the fact that Syracuse has taken such a step up in a class against a defensive opponent, the under actually might have some value here.
We've got Steve Merrill on the line from Pro Sports Info. Please join him right there. Pro Sports Info, not just college football, but the NFL, the NBA, and when Major League Baseball gets back started in the spring. All right. We've got West Virginia, who at number 9 in the college football playoff rankings, obviously has its season in front of it with a trip to Oklahoma. Actually, I believe that game's at home, and then a Big 12 championship game possibility. Taking on Oklahoma State, very odd team. I did a preview that's posted over at SD1 Sports on this game, and Oklahoma State has been abysmal certain weeks. And then other weeks, they beat the likes of Boise State. They beat Texas at home. They played Oklahoma to the wire and could have won that game on 2 separate occasions in the final few minutes. So Oklahoma State, not as big an underdog as they may seem on the surface as a 2-5 team in the Big 12.
Yeah, and you really can't set the total high enough on this game, obviously, with these 2 explosive offenses. Total only 73.5. Very seldom I say it's only 73.5. But you look at what these offensives can do. West Virginia scores 41 a game. Oklahoma State scores 39 a game. And then, of course, last week they had that shootout 48-47 loss against Oklahoma. And you really have to worry about a hangover after a loss like that. An in-state rival, game went back and forth, high-scoring shootout. They lose by a single point late in the game. I definitely think this is a bad spot for Oklahoma State. With that said, though, my power ratings make the game a pick 'em, so there is value with them getting 4.5 points. So the line value is definitely with Oklahoma State in this game. You remember a few weeks ago, I liked Texas as a best, or I'm sorry, I liked Oklahoma State as a best bet against Texas. My power ratings made that game a pick 'em, and Texas was a 3-point road favorite. Once again, my power ratings make this game a pick 'em. West Virginia's laying 4.5, so the line is too high. Unfortunately, I'm very concerned about the scheduling setup for Oklahoma State after that tough loss to Oklahoma last week.
I got to say, Steve, the line amazes me in this situation because West Virginia's obviously got 1 loss. Oklahoma State's a 500 club, 2-5 in the Big 12 against worthy competition. I know that they're losing close games for the most part, but man, they have these abysmal showings at times. And while West Virginia and both of them are top offenses, West Virginia is like an elite offense, and they're a top 25 scoring defense. So Oklahoma State more in the 95 range in scoring defense. So interesting that it's only about a 4-point play right now. All right, let's see. What else do we have? We've got a ton of games that look good on paper, not necessarily worth much this season. I guess Clemson has one of two final games in which it could get upset. It's not a likely candidate the next 2 weeks, whether Duke or South Carolina, but they're teams that are capable, that at least have a puncher's chance. So we've got a Duke team that sits at 7-3 on the season, going to Clemson.
Yeah, my power ratings make it 29. My power ratings continue to say Clemson's an undervalued team. You remember a few weeks ago against NC State, the line was only about 16.5, and my power ratings favored Clemson by 23, and they won that game big. Now, part of that obviously has to do with the fact, scoring margin plays a large part in power ratings. It's always difficult when you have a Clemson team that's won 2 conference games by 60 points or more this year, because that can skew the results a bit. But this is a very good team on both sides of the ball. Not only do they average 7.5 yards per play, they allow just 3.8 yards per play. So they're almost outgaining their opponents by 4 yards per play, which is just unheard of. Duke, meanwhile, is average exact on both sides of the ball. In fact, statistically, they're exactly the same offensively and defenses versus the schedule of opponents they've played. So you've got a completely average team against a very good Clemson team. My power ratings make it 29.5. Current line on this game is around 28.5. So really not a lot of value unless it drops below 28, that key number.
Interesting game in Austin in that the hyper-focused narrative of the college football playoff has everyone focusing on West Virginia and Oklahoma in the Big 12. If Iowa State sweeps its final 2 games, they go to the Big 12 championship. Texas is in a similar situation. They still can work their way in with only 2 losses in the conference. Iowa State at Texas.
Yeah, I think this is a spot where we're going to see what Texas is made of. If you remember when we did our preview show in the summer, Texas was my sleeper at 40-1 to be a national title contender. And I'll tell you what, had they not lost that game against Maryland, things were looking pretty good. Even with the conference loss, they could have still hung in there. I don't think the Oklahoma State loss, that probably is going to be the difference, obviously. But now they have 3 losses, so there's no conversation whatsoever of them having a legitimate shot. But this is still a very good team, is my point. And they're coming in a spot here off the Texas Tech win. After the 2 losses, they bounced back with a win last week, high-scoring win. This is a better defensive team than they showed last week. I look for much better defense at home. And Iowa State has surprisingly had a good season. They're a good offensive team, slightly above average, but a really good defensive team, allowing just 20 points a game. And after that high-scoring shootout last week for Texas, I look for their defense to step up as well. As I mentioned, under 46 might have some value. Should be a low-scoring defensive battle.
And Iowa State is the #1 rush defense in the Big 12. And finally, Steve, we've got the group of 5 taking center stage on ABC primetime on Saturday night. That speaks to this matchup, but it also, I think, more so speaks to the schedule this week. We've got Cincinnati going to Central Florida, riding a 22-game winning streak.
Yeah, Central Florida can score some points. I mean, the question is, can they stop anybody when they need to? Cincinnati had a big offensive game last week against Navy, who's just really down a notch this season, so it's hard to read too much into that. I think the over, once again, is probably worth a look here. I mean, it seems obvious in these Central Florida games, but they really don't seem to be able to stop legitimate opponents.
Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info joins us each and every week right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, to break down the betting odds for you. We enjoy the conversation each and every time, Steve.
Thanks, Mark.